شما
The title of it is Palestine, Israel, What Gives? Obviously means what's happening, but it also means something has to give, which is something I feel very strongly, and I think most of us in this room would agree. The contents. First, I want to emphasize what Kimberly said, and we'll talk about this. There are no enemies here. I am profoundly emotionally involved in this topic for many reasons, and I love Israel and I love Palestine. And I do not think that those are contradictory thoughts or emotions. I feel that very strongly, and that is a big reason why I'm here. Then we'll talk about some history. We could pay years talking about the crisis, so we'll just do a quick history because I know people keep asking me, I don't understand the history. I'll try to go through that very quickly. And then the third part, what is Palestine like today? I've worked quite a lot in Palestine, the West Bank, because I couldn't go to Gaza. So I have seen what it's like to be living as a Palestinian today in the West Bank. And it's very important to share that information, not to demonize the Israelis, but to understand, because it's important to understand, so that we can work for change, all of us. Then the last thing, how can we make it better? I want to give some thoughts about that we can do as Americans, those of us who are Americans, as humans, to try to bring peace here and there. Obviously, we're not going to solve the Middle East crisis in this group of people, but each of us does have a role to play in building peace, and we'll talk about that. For that, the last part, I think the presentation lasts about an hour and a half. You never know. It could be an hour, it could be, I'll try to go fast. But I'd like to break into groups. This is too big a group for giant discussion. So we'll break into smaller groups, maybe 8 people, whatever, turn chairs around, go outside, bring your chairs, and I'll have 2 questions to ask, and I'll have paper. One person will be assigned to be the monitor to bring back questions. And I really want to hear what you have to say. I was raised Unitarian Universalist, and the Universalist side, I want to speak to that. A lot of what this means to me, the original Universalist, the idea of universalism, now many of us are not even theists today, so we've left this, but it was the idea that there is no original sin. And 400 years ago, that was really blasphemy to say there was no original sin. And I think that has lived through in our world today, that we tend to see people as basically good. That's how I see people. And if they go wrong, there's a reason for it. They were abused, or there's always a reason, and I want to understand the reason. The other thing I want to mention is I was raised in a Jewish neighborhood. My friend Amy's here pointed out the word shtetl. Among us girls would call it a shtetl because it was very much a very Jewish neighborhood in East New York, Brooklyn. But the word shtetl it was actually not a shtetl. We were not in Lithuania. The Cossacks were not attacking us in East New York, Brooklyn. And it made me think about the question of how you use language. And this is a little detour. But this morning, talking with Amy about it, I thought, language matters. We have to be kind to people who use words that upset us, because they may not know, they may not understand. At the same time, we have to think about the words we use, how it can trigger people. And I'll give you 2 examples that happened this week. I saw in the New York Post, there was an article that said, demonstrations in Brooklyn call for the eradication of Israel. I thought, oh, that's heavy. Yeah, so I thought, the New York Post, very objective, blah, blah. So I thought about it, and I went to the description of the demonstrations. And one thing that many of the people said, it was largely Arab Muslim, but also allies, was from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And I thought about that, and they were actually at BBC, they were interviewing people, what do you mean by that? They said, oh, we envision a world where Muslims, Christians, and Jews can live together in peace. Oh, okay, me too. But many people don't hear that. When you say from the river to the sea, many Jews and Israelis who suffer from generational trauma hear, you're going to get rid of us to the sea. You know what I mean? And I think about that. It's really important to say, what am I saying? I will not use that expression because I know it triggers, even though I understand what people may mean. So from the river to the sea, yes, peace, beauty, wonderful, get along. But many people hear it differently. So either you have to have an asterisk, this is what I mean, or avoid it. I really think we have to think about our language. Opposite side, a woman from the community was worried about my talk, it'd be too pro-Arab, blah, blah. So she said to me, remember, Palestinians are innocent people, but Hamas and the PLO want to destroy Israel and kill all Jews. How many conversations have you had with members of Hamas? How long did you spend working with the PLO? You know, and it's that kind of statement. This was by email. I didn't even respond. Because when someone goes to that level of extremity, there is no response. It would like be, you know, a 6-hour lunch to explain why that's so not fair. You know, it is more complex. So I want to be careful. And if you hear me saying things that sound unfair or whatever, don't raise your hand now, but afterwards say, you know, you could have phrased this a little bit differently. And I think we should all think for that. Because what I care about is building peace. What I care about is listening to each other and getting to a solution. And attacking and feeling self-righteous doesn't go there. It really is better to listen. Anyway, so I started my life. I was when I went to Staten Island, I was so Jewish that, you know, you leave me alone already, that everyone thought I was Jewish. We were not. I was actually a Shabbos boy. I went on, studied Stuyvesant High School, lots of Jews there. Then I had a junior in the Mediterranean, which changed my life. I went for Venice and I fell in love with Morocco. And that led to a whole career in the Arab world. I'll talk about that. And when I got to Morocco, part of the reason I fell in love with it, they were like Jews and Italians, but even more so. In your face, talking, emotional, this much distance, you know what I mean? Not China, not Japan. Fell in love with it, joined the Peace Corps, was in Tunisia for 3 years, which was among the best 3 years of my life, lived in a small town, which was a lot like Sag Harbor on the water. And then I went back to school and got a master's in Middle East Studies. While I was there, I had a Fulbright in Damascus. I was the first American to study in Syria, which was an incredible experience, and that's a whole book. It was really fabulous. I got practical. I'm from a working class family. I didn't want to be poor, so I got an MBA in Wharton, and then went on and had a career in finance, and then got into helping and into the World Bank, sort of the world. Anyway, so I lived in the 70s and 80s all over the Arab world. I got fluent in Tunisian Arabic and then Standard Arabic. In Syria, I learned Middle Eastern Arabic or Levantine Arabic. I understand Egyptian because I was for 2 years, and I'm pretty good in Gulf and Saudi Arabic. So I'm very, very fond of the Arab world. I have enormous affection for the people. I know it's incredible diversity. So in this country where there's such anti-Arab hostility, it's painful all the time when people talk about the Middle East and say things that are ignorant, frankly. But my specialization, because I speak Arabic and know the region so well, I'm often called to work in the Middle East. I'm working now in Tunisia on a small business finance project, in Saudi Arabia, updating their financial inclusion plan. So I still go back and forth to that part of the world. But I'm also working in Lesotho in South Africa. This included many projects in Palestine. I started working in Palestine, I guess it was in the late 1990s, and have gone back and forth many times. I drafted the financial sector plan for Palestine. I'm very proud of that. Also, the first Islamic bank, I helped set that up. So I've had a good amount of time working with the Palestinians, so I really get what it's like to live there. Those are all my Palestinian papers. You can read them all. That's my peace t-shirt, peace, shalom, salam. My life has made it such that I find both peoples, both cultures, beautiful. And I cannot bear the demonization, and I cannot bear the violence. The first candle is for Kaya Katzman. Sorry. After I leave here, I'm going directly to Princeton to my dear friends, Ron and Sandy, who were Jewish, very, very involved in the Jewish community in Princeton, to celebrate their wedding anniversary. A very close friend of theirs in Princeton, whom I've met, lost her nephew in the Hamas attack at Kibbutz Holit. I don't know Chaim, but I read about him. He's a peace activist and a scholar, and my heart breaks for him. It is heavily. Zichrono lebracha. May his life be a blessing. The second candle is for Heba Zagut. Heba was an art teacher in Gaza City. Her artwork was in the calendar of the Palestine Feminist Collection, a group that I've worked with. She and her 2 children died in an Israeli bombing attack a few days ago in Gaza. Her last text was a selfie in a hallway with 2 of her children saying, "I'm afraid." This is for Heba. For thousands of years, Muslim Middle East hosted complex cosmopolitan urban civilizations, from the Idrisid Fez to Seville to Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid, of Alf Layla wa Layla, 1001 Nights, to Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire, 400 or 500 years. I have taught in the schools on the East End and know how unbelievably little Americans are taught about these cultures, which I think is a big part of the problem, that we don't have the background, and I think that's a huge thing to think about. Under the Ottomans, the last great Muslim civilization, the Middle East was peaceful for over 400 years. And and this is one thing that drives me crazy, when people say the Israelis live in a violent neighborhood or a rough neighborhood. No, not until the 20th century, when the Europeans came in and screwed it up. To the contrary, the Middle East was safer with less conflict than most of Europe for 400 or 500 years. Think about the last 400 or 500 years in Europe. The other thing to realize is that Jews and Christians fared very well in the cosmopolitan Ottoman culture. First of all, within Islam, Islam considers Jews and Christians as fellow people of the book, Ahl al-Kitab, and are a protected class. And if you came to any of my talks at Bay Street, you know much more detail about this. Very different from how Christians view Muslims and Jews. They were protected. And I know from my own experience, I celebrated Passover in Morocco. I taught at a Jewish school in Tunisia. My best friend in Egypt was a Jewish-Christian couple, and I actually swam with a group of Jews in Damascus. Now, they had a hard time, I have to say. The Syrians did not. That was because they were a frontline state. But generally speaking, every older Jewish person I talked to said things were actually quite good before the creation of Israel, which of course changed everything because they became a fifth column. It tilted things. But Jewish culture flowered in Baghdad, Spain, Aleppo, Fez, and Istanbul. And it will tell you that some of the best scholarship in Jewish history was Maimonides and people who lived in the Muslim world. Of course, we all know about the Spanish Inquisition. Who did they kick out? The Muslims and the Jews, who mainly went to North Africa and elsewhere. Then, during the Tanzimat area in Istanbul, which was between 1839 and 1876, the Ottomans officially ended religious discrimination. Muslims were no longer superior to Jews or Christians. Think about the timing of that. The US was fighting a war over slavery when the Ottomans had ended religious discrimination. During the 19th century, the Europeans colonized Ottoman Arab territories, leaving only the Middle East heartland by 1914. The French took North Africa, the British took the Nile and the Gulf states, and Italy got last dibs on Libya. As the Ottoman Empire declined, leading Arab intellectuals imagined a secular, cosmopolitan future. I think many of us here are secular cosmopolitanists. I know I am. So these were my peeps. This is where the Arab world was heading in the 1910s and 1920s. Arab leaders envisioned a Nahda, a new secular pan-Arab civilization. And the leaders of this movement were Christian, Jewish, and Arab, but Arabic speakers. So it was not Turkish, it was an Arabic speaking. Beirut, Alexandria, Cairo, Baghdad, Aleppo, Haifa all became intellectual circles. Michel Aflaq, a Christian, was one of the leaders. You probably heard of Khalil Gibran and others who were active in this movement. But then as the Ottoman departed, the Western powers who had come in and split it up and were controlling it, put their own leaders in place, their own puppet kings, Farouk and others. And then as the Ottoman Empire collapsed during World War I, there was a call for Arab independence. The Arabs wanted their own state, which would go from the border with Turkey all the way down to Yemen along Western Arabia. This is excluding Egypt and excluding Mesopotamia. The British agreed to this. There were contracts, there were letters. They lied. Instead, the British and French secretly agreed to divide the Arab Middle East into interest zones. The French took the north in blue, the British took the south in red. The British took exclusive rights to Mesopotamia, today's Iraq, because oil had been discovered. And I could write a whole gigantic presentation about how oil has destroyed the Middle East. That's another topic, but believe me, that there's nothing that infuriates me more than our oil addiction. The coastal areas would be cut off from the interior. The French carved out Lebanon in favor of Maronite Christians. Now, it was different from Palestine because the non-Christians stayed, but they carved out a 55% majority of Christians, which was the poison in Lebanon's blood till this day. I could go back and explain why the explosion in Beirut is linked to the psychosis of Lebanon's political structure. Palestine would be home for the Jews. I love this quote by Gertrude Bell. She says, "Oil is the trouble, of course, detestable stuff." I went to Gertrude Bell's grave in the Euphrates in Baghdad with a group of people. It was very exciting. The Balfour Declaration established a national home for the Jews in Palestine. Now, one thing to remember is that the Jews in Europe were very well connected. They had people in London, they had more money. So they had a voice in the centers of power that the Palestinians did not have. Now, of course, the Palestinians see this as this global Zionist cabal that controls the world. Or not all Palestinians, some Palestinians. I see it as they had the power, they used it. And what turned out to be for very good reasons, given what happened. So it happened. They had more power, they had more access to the ears of the powerful in Europe. Rothschild and Chaim Weizmann were the two authors of the Balfour Declaration for the British. Rothschild, as you may know, was enormously wealthy. And Chaim Weizmann was a brilliant man, a chemist, a scientist, charismatic, and they both were close to the British government. So the Balfour Declaration led to waves of European immigration to Palestine. In the beginning, there were actually very few Jews in Palestine, only about 5% of the population back in the 19th century. But, and in the late 19th century, Zionism was this kind of weird thing, like back to Africa, Liberia. Hey, Ed, we have the son of the first African-American ambassador to Liberia in the back of the room. Call out. And Liberia, as you know, was a similar concept. You know, that when Abraham Lincoln was during the Civil War, his expectation was that African Americans would go back to Africa. That's actually what he believed. It was only in talks with Frederick Douglass that convinced him, intelligent, thoughtful, that African Americans could be educated at the place that they could integrate into the United States. Before that, he didn't believe it was possible. So it's interesting how history changes. Anyway, so I think that Zionism at that time was viewed as similar, kind of a wacky, extreme thing. Both Reform Jews and Orthodox rejected it. Reform Jews felt that they were a religious group, not a national group. Then history changed. The rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, the Dreyfus Affair, pogroms, made Jews who were not Zionists realize, oh, this is something to think about. We really cannot stay here in Europe. It will never be welcome for us. So it gave the idea of Zionism momentum. Growing waves of European Jewish immigrants, of course, terrified the indigenous Arabs, because all these Europeans, not local Jewish Arabs, because there was a Jewish Arab population. These were Europeans who spoke Yiddish and other languages and who were whiter, were coming in and colonizing the area. By the 1930s, there were fighting. There was a revolt in the area between the incoming population and the indigenous population. Zionists struggled from the beginning with what to do with the native population. They knew that some of the early Zionists did not want a state. They just wanted to live peacefully in Palestine among the indigenous people. But fairly early on, a lot of the Zionist thinkers said, no, we must have a state. Obviously, you're going to have a state. If it's going to be remotely democratic, you have to have a majority, which is demographic. And that's why Israel has, since its beginning, had a demographic challenge, what to do with the non-Jews who live within our state. And there are quotes about this. Weizmann said, the indigenous population was akin to the rocks of Judea as obstacles that had to be cleared on a difficult path. Sharon said, it is the duty of Israeli leaders to explain to public opinion, clearly and courageously, a certain number of facts that are forgotten with time. The first of these is that there is no Zionism, colonialization, or Jewish state without the eviction of the Arabs and the expropriation of their lands. So this was a big debate, and this is actually a map of the World Zionist Organization claim on Palestine, which was bigger than historical Palestine, included parts of Egypt and into the Jordan and southern Lebanon. So there were, and again, not all Zionists, but within Zionism, there was a debate about what to do with the Palestinians, the indigenous population. Waves of Jews landed in Palestine despite British restrictions. There was nowhere for the Jews to go when things were getting bad. And this is what drives me nuts. The French, British, and Americans closed their doors to world Jewry. Congress made a law, for example, giving preference to farmers because they knew Jews were not farmers. And I often think that, can you imagine if the Americans had said, come here? We'd have twice as many Jews, which in my opinion would be great. And I'm going to say this honestly. I think Jewish Americans have been one of the most successful minorities in centuries. I mean, think about it. Think about what Jewish Americans' contribution to our culture in law, in finance, in cinema, and et cetera, et cetera. So twice as many Jews for me would be, because I'm terrified of Christian fundamentalists, so twice as many Jews would be fabulous, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, plus we wouldn't have had all these problems in the Middle East. Of course, I'm not a Zionist, so that to me would have been a fantasy that would make me happy. It didn't happen because the Americans were terrified of the Jews coming for many reasons. One, they were not Christian, but also they thought they were communists. And during this period, there's a lot of anti-communism. The Jews were leftists, like my neighbors in Brooklyn. So they said, send them to Palestine. In other words, give the problem to the Arabs, who had nothing to do with the European situation. So the fighting broke out among British Jews and Arabs, all killing each other. The British wanted to wash their hands of the mess. And if anyone is guilty of this mess, it is the British, really. And my mom's Irish, so anyway, they turned to the United Nations for a resolution. Resolution 181 proposed 2 states between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And this is what the 2 states look like. If the Palestinians had known how powerless they were against the Zionists, they should have said yes. It was not a bad deal. There were many things about it. The part that is green, which was giving to the Zionists, was going to be about 55% Jewish. The orange part was about 99% non-Jewish. So there was and both of them were required to have constitutions that protected religious freedom. So it was like really not a bad idea. The things that pissed them off, for example, the Zionists got a lot, which split the Arab world in half. And also look at the map. It's really hard to make a state when you have these like squiggles. Looks like a Rorschach test. So the Arabs fought back. Now, I'm still not sure who represented the Palestinians. I've looked at this. The Egyptians, the Iraqis, the Jordanians, and the Syrians were states. Now, how long had they been states? Yeah, 20 years, 20, 25. So the time between now and 9/11 is longer than the time Egypt had been a state. Actually, Syria had been a state for 2 years. They were provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So they were completely disorganized. Plus, they were fighting each other. Abdullah wanted the West Bank, and the Egyptians were hoping they would. So there was a mess. The Palestinians, meanwhile, who spoke for the Palestinians? I don't understand. I've never seen anywhere. There was never a symposium or a discussion or a plebiscite. Nothing. Of course, a lot of Palestinians didn't like what happened, but the Palestinians were the ones who had no voice, as far as I can tell, in the decision. It was the Arab states that attacked Israel. Now, the Israelis had, by this time, technically they're Israelis now, no longer Zionists. I think of it as the date, had a huge upper hand. They had arms from Czechoslovakia. They had Golda Meir in New York collecting millions and millions of dollars, which is true. So they had a huge upper hand over the Arabs who were disorganized. Plus, they were fighting for a state which they desperately wanted. They couldn't go back. This was not the French in Algeria. They had a very different passion. Whereas the Egyptians and the Syrians and whatever are fighting for someone else's battle. Palestinians themselves were barely armed compared to the other states. So, and at the time, the Palestinians, as you will often hear it said, the Palestinians fled or were expelled. You know how you hear that all the time? Fled or were expelled, because that's such a contentious phrase. Israel in 1949 ended up covering over 77% of historic Palestine, even though they were about 20, 30% of the population. So it felt terribly unjust, as you can imagine, to the Arabs. On the right, you have after 48, when there was an armistice between the two sides. Now, there are always competing narratives. For example, when you're talking about 48, which was the Nakba in Arabic means calamity or disaster. You talk about 48, Israeli image is Arab leaders exhorted the Palestinians to leave and they abandoned their homes to incoming Zionists. So they all walked away, left their homes empty, and the Zionists came in. No fighting. I mean, Zionists were forces were facing a superior enemy, but through pluck, they overwhelmed them. That's the Israeli version. The Palestinian version is the Zionists were supported by Europe, the US, and the Arabs were no match. The Zionists committed genocide with multiple acts of violence. Now, I've looked at this, and like everything else, the truth is somewhere in between. It's always more complicated. We do know that there were cases where Arab leaders exhorted Palestinians, including with microphones, to leave. One example is in Haifa. A lot of the leading families left to Lebanon because they were told, go now, you'll be safer. Of course, they didn't expect that their homes would be expropriated. And of course, the wealthy usually leave first. That's always the case. The poor are left behind. But there were violent acts and killings of Palestinian civilians. I've met my friend Hiba, her grandmother, whom I've met, saw her brother shot by Zionists. And there were villages that were wiped out. All Arabs would talk about Kfar Qasim and Dar Yassin and the villages. However, to be very clear, this was not the rape of Nanjing, but they did commit ethnic cleansing. They expelled the Palestinians, whether through direct force or through fear. And then after the Palestinians left, they were told, you cannot come back. That's a fact. And that is the definition of ethnic cleansing. So maybe not genocide, but certainly ethnic cleansing. And again, all of these are judgmental and all of these are not yes or no. The creation of Israel changed the course of Arab history. It redefined states along religious ethnic lines. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was moving towards secularism. And now you have a Jewish state, a Christian state, and then what does that mean? What are the other ones? Muslim states. So the states that were becoming more secular pushed back to becoming more Muslim defined, at least some of them. It also showed Arab impotence. Muslim Arabs paid for European sins with no apology and no compensation. And this is really the seeds of the disaster, the humiliation and the injustice that happened in 48. It also led to the flight of the indigenous Jews. Jewish Arabs in Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, Syria, as I said, were doing fairly well. And then after Israel was created, several things happened. One is that they became a fifth column. People didn't trust them, especially in the frontline states of Egypt and Syria. Additionally, the Zionists wanted the Jews of the Middle East to come to Palestine because of the demographic issue. And there were affairs like the Lavon affair in Egypt, where Zionists blew up Egyptian positions to blame it on Egyptians, so that or they blew up Jewish places to blame it on the Egyptians so that the Jews would flee, and then they were discovered. So the Zionists themselves were working within, and there's also a belief that in Baghdad, some of the attacks on the Jewish installations in Baghdad were performed by Zionists to get the Jews to flee. Now, this is extremely contentious, but each side believes the opposite on that. However, there is definitely evidence that the Zionists wanted the Jews of the Middle East to come to Israel. When I talk to Jewish friends in North Africa, for example, I have a very dear friend who owns a restaurant. He says he can't stand Israelis because when he meets Israelis, they always say, you're not a Jew until you come to Israel. And he says, no, I'm a Tunisian who's Jewish. He feels that very strongly. And he says the Israelis say to him, no Jew should be living outside of Israel, except the United States, because we want their money and their arms. So there was a big flight of Arab Jews to Israel after 48. That mainly happened in 67, later, between 56 and 67, which almost doubled the population of Israel. Today, about half the population of Jewish Israelis are Mizrahi or Sephardim, meaning non-Ashkenazi. So it was a big part. And as you may know, that's a big part of the divisions within Israel, is between the two peoples. It created a sense of a narrative of loss and injustice, and it sparked a cycle of demonization in the West, which is what I see. When the Palestinians fought back, which was unsurprising that they did, they were declared terrorists. And they have been seen as terrorists since 1948, a very simple narrative. And it displaced over 700,000 Palestinians who were either outside of today's Palestine or in the West Bank and Gaza. Adding to the pressure was oil. I'm not going to talk about that, but there's a whole course on how oil affected the Middle East. Then what happened after 48? And I'm going to go through very quickly through this part. In 56, one of the things that happened right after the war in the early 50s was that the leaders, these puppet king leaders, Farouk in Egypt, etc., were deemed incompetent by their populations. There was fury of the Arab populations in Palestine and the surrounding states. So there were revolutions. The most significant was the coup in Egypt when Gamal Abdel Nasser took power. So you had this group of very anti-Israeli Arab leaders. And at the time, the United States was fairly neutral on it, but a couple of things happened. 80% of Europe's oil flowed through the Suez. So the Suez was a critical channel for the Europeans. Nasser in 1956 tried to negotiate with the British to get a better deal. Since the British and French had built the Suez Canal, they were taking all the receipts from it, or most of the receipts. And the Egyptians said, this is in our country, we want to take a fairer share. The British refused. They were the colonial power. And Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 56. This infuriated the British and French. They worked with the Israelis and they attacked in 1956, the Suez War. Interestingly, Eisenhower, our president, was the one who told them to back off. That was a period of enormous American popularity in the Middle East. because we were the ones to say, take a step back. But that also cemented the view in the Arab world of Israel as an extension of colonial European power, because they sided with the British and French against the Egyptians after the nationalization. Relations between the US and Egypt continued to sour. In 1956, we had promised to build the Aswan Dam, the Americans. In 1956, Nasser recognized communist China. And Dulles, you know that second airport in Washington? John Foster Dulles was so furious that he said, we're not doing it. So Nasser turned to the Soviets. And that was the beginning of the Cold War. Israeli on the American side, Syria and Egypt on the Soviet side. And as you know, that was 40 years then of animosity between the two. The Soviets supported the Arabs with both weapons, and the US supported Israel. On June 5th, 1967, the Egyptians were talking a lot of anger about the Israelis. The Soviets were supplying them. The Israelis had much better intelligence, much better surveillance. And in 1967, fearing a war, they attacked the Egyptian forces on the ground, destroying them. Now, I remember being a kid in Brooklyn, all the Israeli flags, and we were so happy and glorious, and we thought of the Israelis as kind of supermen. Of course, from the Arab point of view, it was Pearl Harbor. It was a surprise attack. It was not following the rules of war. And I always often think if the Japanese had won in World War II, California would be saying Pearl Harbor was a glorious moment of getting the Americans before they could fight back. It led to, etc. But the history, of course, is written by the victors. So as joy enveloped Israel, who took the Sinai, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and Gaza, enormous grief. As much as the joy was here, was despair in the Arab world. They could not fight the Israelis. They could not fight the United States. Nasser, who was the huge, handsome, charismatic, he would switch back and forth between standard Arabic and dialect, incredible, charismatic guy. He died of a heart attack shortly after. So it was the deer for the Arab world. Sadat was smart. He realized you can't fight the Americans. So he turned the tables and he attacked Israel in a surprise attack in October, which allowed for a partial victory. And I think what that did was, first of all, it gave the Sinai back to Egypt, which they wanted. It restored Arab dignity, partially. They weren't quite as humiliated. And it eventually led to Egypt recognizing Israel. I was in Tunisia when Sadat went to Jerusalem, and I remember sitting in a cafe with a bunch of Tunisians, and it was really like watching someone on the moon. It was so unexpected. And the next day, the Libyan newspaper came out, and it had a big picture of Sadat upside down, one word, kha'in, which means traitor in Arabic. So, the Libyans had a much fiercer view. The Tunisians were more relaxed, and they were like, whatever, time passes. The Egyptians also wanted to be part of the Israeli gravy train. Israel has gotten about 1/3 of our foreign aid for the last 50 years, which is way a topic for discussion as far as I'm concerned. The Egyptians got an agreement to get about half. So that was big. Unfortunately, most of it has been military. Okay, but this did nothing for the Palestinians. Now I'm going to finish the history part very quickly. Without any Arab support, the Palestinians were left on their own. Millions lived in diaspora as refugees, and millions lived under Israeli occupation. Violence in the West Bank and Gaza ebbed and flowed with various attempts at resolution, including the Oslo Accords in 1993 and the Barak-Clinton plan in 2000. Now, these failed, in my view, thanks to two things: right-wing Israeli sabotage and Palestinian incompetence. And there's, you look back and Barak was really close to something happening, and then Arafat couldn't make a decision. And of course, who was Arafat? Does he really speak? And it never happened. And these were probably pretty good partial solutions, but they didn't happen. One of the questions was whether Arafat, who was adored in Palestine, Muammar, if he could become a statesman from being a revolutionary. And that's a tough shift to make it happen.
We don't sell out to the public. We're a wholesale supplier. Hell, at least you ask. Goddamn thieves been stealing my crop all season.
Where I come from, olive theft is a huge problem, too.
Now, where's that?
Palestine?
Damn, that's a couple hours away.
No, not Palestine, Texas. Palestine. Land of milk and honey.
Israel, man. Israel.
Oh, Shalom.
Yeah, it's a real branding issue.
Palestinians grow frustrated by their suppression of their aspirations. This leads to violence, which then feeds the Israeli narrative that they can never be trusted. This leads to right-wing governments who suppress the Palestinians more. So there's a cycle. If there's violence, the Israelis vote for the right-wingers. If they're right-wingers, they're worse to the Palestinians, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the thing is, how do we break that cycle? I remember an analogy of a burning building to describe the Israeli-Palestinian drama. A man falls out of a building and lands on another. They immediately begin fighting. Obviously, the man who's falling is the European Jews, and the man they land on is the Palestinians. And then my question is, but who started the fire? You know, how do we get them to apologize? How do we move to the next stage? Regardless of whose fault this is, the Israelis will never have real peace without including the Palestinians in the solution. In the following pages, I'm going to go to the second part. I'm going to talk about some of my observations. And this part is my personal observations, but I think it's important to see. And as I said, I spent over several years, I've worked a lot in Palestine, so I know what it's like. And you know, I say Palestine. I don't say the occupied territories. To me, Palestine is a country. To get there, I have to go through Israel, because that's the way it's structured. I have to pass through Israel to get to Palestine, but I am in Palestine. There are many Israelis occupying it, but it's still Palestine. The majority, something like 4/5 of the nations of the world, recognize the state of Palestine. The ones who do not recognize the state of Palestine are overwhelming the white ones, you know, Canada, Europe, United States, Australia. But if you look at Africa, Latin America, Asia, South Asia, they all recognize the state of Palestine. And I recognize the state of Palestine today. I mean, what the future will be, I don't know. But I feel that I'm going to Palestine, not to the occupied territories. Anyway, for my projects, I interviewed small business owners with financing needs. That's one of my projects. So I'd go to ice cream maker Nablus, keep going. He was a fabulous guy, 50-year-old business, and a home builder in Rawabi, an industrial park in Jericho, a car repair shop in Bethlehem, and the small business council in Hebron, Khalil. I was never allowed to go to Gaza. Even though my contract required me going to Gaza, the Israelis never permitted it. This was not about my security. The Gazans would have swamped me with hummus. They loved me. But the Israelis, I believe they don't want foreigners to see what's happening because people are not allowed in Gaza. Journalists are not allowed in Gaza. So I never got to Gaza. I communicated with my colleagues in Gaza via Skype or whatever. That's me speaking with a Gazan, in fact. The distance from Hebron to Gaza is about the distance from Bridgehampton to West Hampton. So it's not a distance problem. It's an Israeli refusal problem. On these projects, I often travel with my core team. Keep going. Yeah, that's them. Diama, whom I adored, she's now a professor of economics at Birzeit University. Her grandmother was the one who saw her brothers killed, and I met her grandmother. She was probably in her 80s at the time. Carrie, the second woman, was actually an American, a Christian evangelical, whose images and views of the Palestinians changed over time. It was fascinating. Muhammad, which is my right-hand man, very smart, and Jamel, on the right, was my driver. He was an interesting guy. He fluent Hebrew speaker, lived in East Jerusalem, could pass for Israeli, so it was great to have him because we had Israeli license plates and we can go anywhere if I was with him. I didn't have to worry about it. But he was also the most hostile of anyone I knew to the Israelis. It was interesting, partly because he was very religious. So saw it as a Muslim-Jewish apocalyptic battle. The West Bank, keep going, has been broken up into dozens of small patches isolated from each other by Israeli incursion. The legacy of 1993 Accords, which were supposed to be transitional. See the orange? That's Area C, which is completely under Israeli control. So as you can see, the vast majority of the West Bank is under Israeli control. Palestinians may not go there without permit or without. The grayer areas are A and B. The lighter gray is under full Palestinian control. It has been delegated to the PLO, so the Palestinian Authority, so the PNA. and the areas around it are joint Palestinian control. So the Palestinians actually have very little geography that they can go freely in. The Israelis have increasingly settled the areas under Israeli control, and this is my biggest point of rage, what's happened with the settlements. It's against international law and against the accords. The Palestinian areas, the A, which I showed in the former page, are 18% of the West Bank, whereas the Israeli-controlled areas, the C, are 60% of the West Bank. Not Israel, of the West Bank. So it's a small portion. This severely limits Palestinian activities, whether home building, business, or agriculture. And as someone who is trying to build the Palestinian economy, it was so depressing. When you talk to World Bank people or Europeans, they're so furious with the Israelis because it was very, very clear they were trying to destroy any attempt at making a Palestinian economy. And I have felt as an article of faith that if people have the ability to pay their mortgage and to finance their school's education, et cetera, they will never be violent. I feel that people, when they have economic stability, do not get violent. It's the young men who don't have a job, who can't afford an apartment to get married, who are out at the front lines. That's always the case. So economic investment is very, very important to build peace. Anyway, so the Jewish settlements are all in the 60% that is under Israeli control. Keep going. Travel among these Palestinian islands is deeply fraught. They're segregated by license plate. So there's sort of Israeli only, which is mainly Jewish only when you're in the West Bank, or Palestinian, which is a white license plate. The white license plate is severely restricted where you can go. You can see the roads. The white roads are allowed for Palestinians. The yellow Palestinians cannot go on at all. And the red roads they can go on, but with special permission. And you'll be seeing this, that the settlers we go zooming by, on their roads, and they are going on this crummy back road that's Palestinian, which is usually broken up and has no shoulder and da-da. So you can imagine the feeling, it is apartheid. When people say it's not apartheid, I said, it happens again and again. Well, people say, it's not apartheid. I said, oh, when were you in the West Bank? I said, well, I haven't been there. Well, then you don't know. It is not apartheid in Israeli proper. Israeli proper, the Palestinians are second-class citizens, but it's not apartheid. But it is apartheid in the West Bank. And I have traveled with South Africans who said this is actually worse than apartheid because in South Africa, the blacks were employed by the whites. So the economies were somewhat integrated, which meant they had to deal with one another. The Palestinians are completely segregated. Their economies are shut out. Since the Intifada, in fact, if you go to Israel, it's really striking how the foreign workers are from Nepal and Thailand. There are very few Palestinians because they want to keep them separated. So they've created these islands which have very little contact with the Israeli economy and very little contact with each other. So imagine how frustrating that is. And for many Palestinians, I took this picture. I was sitting in a bus traveling. There's a Palestinian next to me, and there are Jewish settlers on the road. And this is one of the places where the roads cross. And for many Palestinians, it's the only time they see Jewish Israelis, is from a bus or whatever. And I remember thinking, he's looking at them and thinking, what is he thinking? I'm just thinking, what is he thinking? Of these women that he could never talk to. And it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart because I feel, if you know me, that the only way to make peace is with contact. Breaking bread, talking together, getting to know each other. That walls and barriers and obstacles are the antithesis of creating peace. When you leave the segregated areas, Palestinians must pass through multiple checkpoints. There are over 500 checkpoints of various kinds in the West Bank. And I've been with the Palestinians going through them. My first time was Nablus, which is my very favorite Palestinian city. It's to the north, and it's under the rich cultural influence of Damascus, a city that I love. Great food. Whenever I go to Nablus, I go to the Shifa hammam, get my massage, hang out with people, drink our coffee, and then I go off for knefe, the best knefe in the Middle East. That's a dessert over there. These two little boys were adorable. They were coming back from somewhere holding a jasmine flower for their mom, so I took their picture. I thought they were cute. On the photograph of Nablus, you'll see beautiful old Nablus. The white buildings above, that's a Jewish settlement. And everywhere you go, you're in the Palestinian village, above on a hill, looming over you is a Jewish settlement. You may not go there. It looks different. It feels to me that the Israelis want the Palestinians to leave, so this is kind of a threat upon them. My first trip to Nablus from Ramallah was an eye-opener. I went at night. I had to take two buses, disembarking halfway at a major checkpoint. when I got to the waiting area, it was a field about this big with barbed wire everywhere. And you come out through these things that look like that on the bottom, shuffled in like cattle. And we're waiting there, and I had to pee. So I asked one of the Palestinians, we were chatting, I'm friendly, where's the bathroom? He said, he pointed to the fence. And there are old people and whatever, I mean, you really feel like animals. You feel like animals. That's what I felt like. They laughed anyway. So I took my phone out, I was gonna take a picture, and when the flash went off, they'll take your picture, they'll arrest you, so I put it away. And actually that did happen once in Bethlehem. I snuck a picture and an Israeli guard turned and saw it, a woman, and she said, give me your phone. And if I had been Palestinian, it would have been real trouble because I was American. She just deleted the last photos. So I have very few pictures because I'm not allowed. And I think that's part of the problem, is the censorship of what goes out. Anyway, the trip took over 4 hours. Sometimes it took 2. So Hebron Konkoma took 4 hours. This is not the Hamptons in the summer. This is like Tuesday.
ليش انت هون؟
I need toilet paper, lemons. What we have here?
Security chief, move now!
أحلى بنت في فلسطين.
My house, it's just there. طيب بابا طيب ولا شيء مش مشكلة بنحل يلا نمشي.
In addition to the many checkpoints, there's a barrier wall. The first time I saw it in Jerusalem, it was at night. I was driving by this huge thing, and I asked the taxi driver, he said, what is that? He said, a nidar. And the word for wall in Tunisian Arabic is different, so it took me a moment. I said, nidar, it's the wall. And I began to cry. I don't know how to explain it, how it felt. It felt like Baghdad, the same thing, these giant walls everywhere that we're building to separate people. If you ever go to Bethlehem, stay at Banksy's walled-off hotel. Fabulous. It's right at the corner of the walls, and it's has great Banksy art everywhere, and it's very ironic. Lots of things about the wall. As you know, Palestine is the western edge of the Fertile Crescent. And Palestine, again, despite the mythology, it was always green. It gets less green as you go east. Sort of think of California and Nevada. So Jordan is Nevada, and the Palestinian coast is California. It's always been quite damp, you know. So it was very traumatic for the Palestinians to be pushed away from the coast because that's where the water is. And it's been a battle over water since. In 1978, I took a course entitled Hydropolitics in the Middle East with this great Texan hydrologist. At the time, next page, the Israelis still controlled, this was after the 67 war, but before Sadat had negotiated back the Sinai. And our professor said, just based on water surplus and water deficit, the Israelis will return the Sinai. They'll want to get rid of Gaza, because Gaza is at the edge of the desert. They'll want to keep the Golan, which is Syria. They'll want to keep the West Bank, and they'll want to take the Litani River in Lebanon, just based on water. All of those became true. So obviously water is the issue, and it's getting worse. Amman and Jordan has become the center, and we have someone from Amman here, of all these refugees of American wars, and they're running out of water because it's in the desert. We cannot understand the conflict with understanding the water. Oslo Accords gave the Israelis over 71% of the water, Palestinians 17, which is one of the reasons it was so contentious, because it was so unfair. The Israelis today have 87% of the water, the Palestinians 13. So there's a huge water gap. The Palestinians drink on average, or have on average, about 70 liters of water a day. The Israelis about 300 liters of water a day. So water is a big issue. And of course, Gaza, as you may know, and now Gaza, people are drinking poisoned water because there is no water. It comes from Israel. Water has intentionally been shifted away from the Palestinians towards Israel, including and especially the settlements. Keep going. There's a picture of Ma'ale Adumim, a huge settlement outside of Jerusalem, which looks like some California spa, you know, in the desert, greenery everywhere. And of course, to sustain that takes lots of water, which is not going to Palestinian farmers. Let's talk about the settlements. The illegal Jewish settlements in the West Bank have grown dramatically, especially in the last decade, and especially since Netanyahu's government. This is just a picture of their growth. Countries that consider Israeli settlements to be a violation of international law. The green is yes, which is every country in the world except the United States. And the orange is not necessarily illegal, that's the United States. This is something to remind us that we are the outlier on Israel. We are always the one that defends Israel when the rest of the world says, wait a minute, you know, that these are illegal in the US. It's very important to know that 2/3 of American vetoes at the United Nations for the last 40 years have been to protect Israel from any kind of disapproval, any kind of condemnation. Gigantic. So the settlements happened because the United States allowed it. We must understand that. The United States allowed, encouraged, and financed the settlements. That's extremely important to understand and to know, because to me, that's one of the biggest things that we need to change. Because I believe the settlements are killing Israel. I do. Because you cannot have a two-state solution with the settlements in the West Bank. They're now widely distributed within the Israeli-controlled areas. This is just a picture of how many there are, and you'll see that they're all over, not just including between the Palestinian areas. The settlements near Hebron are among the oldest and most aggressive. This is because the tombs of the patriarchs have been there. Hebron is one of the strangest places I've ever been, Khalil in Arabic, because the very aggressive, very religious, and very messianic Jewish settlements are right up against the Palestinians. Palestinians have been cleared out of large parts, and they'll throw rocks at them. You have a feeling that the Jewish settlers, they're not my people. You know what I mean? When I'm in Tel Aviv, I feel these could be my people, but the Jewish settlers are really out there. Like they're the Hamas on the other side. You know, they're crazy, they're apocalyptic, etc. They always have guns. Palestinians cannot carry guns, so it's very much one-sided. Imagine during the Jim Crow era if all white people had guns and no black people did. So that's the feeling that you have. In Hebron, there's a place where there's a Palestinian market that has wire on top, and Jewish settler kids, I want to be careful when I say Jewish, settler kids will throw garbage onto it. I would speak to the soldiers. This guy, I thought he was really cute and friendly, so I wanted to talk to him. And they're like guarding these settlers, and most of them can't stand the settlers. They're from Ashkelon and Tel Aviv, and they're like us. They're liberal people, they're secular, and they think these settlers are, but they have to guard them as their job. Who are our allies among the Palestinians and among the Israelis? Most of the people in this room, I think, just from your faces, are progressives who are looking for people who want to make peace. Who are our allies? There are Palestinians and Israelis who want to live together, who want to work together. And we need to find them and give them support, make them feel that they're not alone. It's extremely important. Breaking the Silence is a group of veteran soldiers who have served in the Israeli military who refused to serve in the West Bank because of what was happening.
כל הקצינים של הפלוגה נקראו לבית הדסה, והאחראית על החינוך נכנסת והיא אומרת, תקשיבו, איזה מתוקים שבאתם, איזה מזל שאני פוגשת אתכם, רציתי להגיד לכם משהו. נורא מלחיץ להיות ילד יהודי בחברון. אז אם אתם רואים אותם, עושים כל מיני שטויות, אל תביאו אותם למשטרה. תביאו אותם אליי ואני אחנך אותם. עכשיו, זאת אישה שיש כאילו אינסוף סרטונים שלה מרביצה לכל מיני פעילים ולפלסטינים ויורקת על אנשים ועיתונאים, אבל היא אחראית על חינוך בחברון, וכשהיא אומרת, רואים אותם עושים שטויות, אז מה שהיא מתכוונת זה זורקים אבנים לתוך השוק הפלסטיני, תוקפים פלסטינים, משתמשים בגז פלפל על פלסטינים ברחובות שלשניהם מותר ללכת.
אין דבר כזה לעצור באמת ילד של יהודי שחי בחברון מלעשות משהו. אין דבר כזה לעצור יהודי מלעשות משהו.
If you see something of an Israeli doing something to a Palestinian, זה לא קשור אליך בכלל. אתה פשוט מסתכל וזהו.
תראי את הדלת, לשבת פה בכלל.
יאללה, אופי הביתה.
שרמוט. ואז מגיע פורים.
פורים. כן, אז הגיע פורים. Next to Beit Hadassah, there was maybe 40 or 50 Israelis that were there. And then they start throwing bottles at the Palestinian home. You know, it's very, very close, maybe like 20 meters away. They're throwing bottles, empty bottles, right? And they've been drinking all day. אז יש להם המון בקבוקים, okay? המון. And then the windows, most of them were just bars, okay? And the bottle would hit the bar and then shatter. It would go into the house. And then we started hearing a baby cry. And we realized that one of the rooms was the baby's room. I wanted to like get involved. ואז המשטרה הגיעה בסוף, אבל מה? They're friends with each other. And they get there, they don't do anything. And then my mem spoke to me, and he was like, I think it's best if you go back to Nitkanim until this is all over. So we left.
This is what I saw in Hebron. I saw incredible animosity and unfairness, and the Palestinians just have to walk through like a black person in the South in 1930. If you react, you're in trouble. You know, you can really get, and that's what I saw. What I also want to say, though, and this is important to say it, these soldiers are my heroes because they're standing up, but it's also not easy for them. You know, Israel has moved to the right. So these guys are under a lot of pressure. Some of them have left Israel. And on the other hand, could soldiers who disagreed with the government in Egypt or Saudi Arabia make a film like this? Israel still retains much of what we care about as a democracy, but it is fading, you know, and that's what we need to fight to keep that democracy alive, that it does not become Saudi Arabia or Egypt. I want to share two stories about the settlements. I'm just going to read them very quickly. One is the harvest season in Palestine. We saw an ad about come and join us for picking the olives with farmers. And it was a group called the International Solidarity Movement, a European group. And Europeans are very involved in this, very few Americans, because we have such different views. Europeans have seen a different media about the Middle East. Americans have seen a very different media for the last 50 years. And if you want examples of that, I can show you. We have really seen an anti-Arab media in this country since I was 10. Anyway, so there are the Europeans are very involved. And this was a group, we went to help Abu Bahar, a farmer, pick his olives. And I actually love picking olives. It's very satisfying, you know, picking the green and the black. And we were there picking our olives. We had this delicious lunch. That's Sada with the red. Go to the next page. And then some settlers arrived. And then the Israeli soldiers came. And then the commander came. We were just finishing our repast when suddenly one of the kids said, "Mustoltanin, settlers." Immediately, the level of tension shot through the roof. Sarah and Abu Bahar got up to investigate. Sarah warned us to keep eating as if nothing had happened. I noticed that the mother and the two kids got extremely tense. The kids popping up to see what was going on like two young baboons after a lion had been sighted. I could smell their fear. Sarah then came back and told us that two jeeps of settlers were parked on the Jewish-only road above, between the farm and Yitzhar, about 100 meters away. They were training their binoculars on us and shouting things over a walkie-talkie in Hebrew. In the quiet of the valley, I could hear their irate voices. We were told to keep eating and not to say or do anything provocative if they came down. Then some soldiers, this is not the story, but some soldiers came, there was discussion on whether we had the permits, blah, 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 blah. And I noticed the Israeli commander, whose name was Sidki, was speaking Arabic. And I'm a total language maven, so anyone who speaks a second or third language is like, woohoo! And he was Ashkenazi, which is, I can count on one hand the Ashkenazim that I met who spoke Arabic. Obviously, a lot of the Mizrahi do because they're from Egypt or whatever. So he spoke Arabic, bad Arabic with a Hebrew accent, but still, he spoke Arabic. So that made me impressed. So I went up. I told the group I was dying to go over and see what was going on. They all counseled against it. The main view was that the Israelis would arrest me and I'd be deported. This apparently happens a lot to the ISM types. I didn't think that this was likely since I was just going to politely mosey over and ask if I could listen. Layla, one of the women, said, well, if anyone here could do it, you could, saying I was disarming or something to that effect. I walked up next to Abu Bahar and the commander and casually began to listen. The commander said, may I help you? In English, in a non-threatening way. I said that I was just curious to understand what was going on using my most conciliatory tone. The commander said that would be fine, but let me just finish explaining to Abu Bahar. I said, sure, not mentioning that I understood the Arabic. After a few minutes, it must have become apparent that I was following the conversation. At one point, Abu Bahar did not understand something the commander said, so I clarified it. It turned out that the maps were Google-like areas with far more detail, pages of resolutions of the whole West Bank on sectors of kilometers with colored circles all over. The blue areas were for Palestinian identity card holders only during the season. Neither foreigners nor Israelis were allowed in. This rule held during the 2 months of the harvest, presumably so that the Palestinians could pluck their olives in relative peace, because there have been many cases where the settlers have attacked the farmers, burned their olive trees, and again, this has been filmed, so you can see it. The commander introduced himself to Abu Bahar. His name was Sidki, which means trustworthy in Arabic, and he explained it was the same in Hebrew. He gave Abu Bahar his cell phone number, and I told him that if he had any problems, and he told him that if he had any problems or need any further clarification, he could call him at any time, Sidki to the farmer. His whole demeanor was open, helpful, and respectful. I was impressed. Sarah then came up and asked if we could at least help harvest for the afternoon. Sidki said that if foreigners went back down, the settlers would surely call the soldiers again, then the soldiers would have to come back, it would be a problem. The whole time his tone was never threatening, he was just explaining the rules of the game. Sidki also mentioned that his goal was to help the Palestinian farmers harvest their olives with as little hassle as possible. Sarah and Ibrahim decided to go back down and continue harvesting since, as Palestinians, they were free to help. Sidki then came over to our little foreign group, the group about 7 or 8 of us, Europeans and me, I think because I had made a sort of psychological bridge, and he said something vaguely friendly. The young leftists were cool, but polite. But then the Australian, an older gentleman, said something like, well, I hope you find a better job someday. If Sidki understood, his English wasn't great, he didn't take the bait. Before Sidki headed back to the jeep, I shook his hand, and I thanked him for his clarity. He asked where I'd learned Arabic, and I told him a little about what I was doing here and elsewhere in the Middle East. I almost took out my card, and then I thought better of it. I asked where he was from, and he told me Ashdod, the port city south of Tel Aviv. I have found the Israelis from the coast to be overwhelmingly sane. The country seems to be self-selecting as the fanatics and ultra-Orthodox head east to the Arabs, and the high-tech secular Israelis migrate west to the coast. This mirrors the extreme contrast between entering Israel via Allenby from Jordan, hostile, tough, threatening, and Ben Gurion, friendly, accommodating, modern. I had always come in from either Egypt or Jordan until one day I flew Delta business class into Ben Gurion. It was like, welcome to Israel, Mr. Dorph. What? I was used to getting examined and everything else. So it's two different. Israel has two faces, the Western face and the Eastern face, which are extremely, extremely different. After he left, the young folk had a debate about the commander. I don't think that they approved of my shaking his hand like a quisling. I explained that I thought the occupation was as legal as they did. I'd been coming to the Arab world since before they were born, but I didn't see any point in demonizing an individual. Within the stupidity of the occupation, at least this guy was doing his job admirably, with respect and effectiveness. Someone said he'd probably beat up the Palestinians if he weren't there. I said that could be true, but I can only say what I see. Moreover, my gut feeling was that he was a decent human being. There have been plenty of stories of Israeli soldiers who gratuitously abused the Palestinians. In fact, There was a column on it in Haaretz the day that I left. Haaretz is the liberal Israeli newspaper. It is absolutely one of the best sources of information about what's going on in the Middle East. I subscribe. Yes, Gideon Levy is great. But you have to bear witness to see what you see and to honor those individuals who seem to be trying to do the right thing in a terrible situation. So hats off and mazel tov to Sadki. Let me continue. The next story is from within a settlement. I had realized, keep going, all this time with the Palestinians, I were looking at the settlements and seeing them as horrible Martian invaders. You know, I was beginning to hate them, hate the people, hate the settlements themselves. I do not like to demonize. I just don't. Because I feel that even Trump supporters or whatever you want to demonize are people who have their reasons, even if I may profoundly disagree. So I decided to do something. It turned out a woman that I knew in college, Nama, a good friend of my older brother, had converted to Orthodox Judaism and was living in a settlement in the West Bank. So I finagled a Shabbat dinner, and I was invited in Kfar Adumim, about halfway between Jerusalem and Jericho, so deep in the West Bank. Next page. I did not take pictures, but it was about 8 or 9 people, and I'll read the story. That's Kfar Adumim when I was there. Nama lives in Kfar Adumim, an illegal settlement on the West Bank, due east from Jerusalem, halfway to Jericho. Nama is a particularly good-hearted soul, and I enjoyed walking with her around the Tayalet, the promenade rimming the settlement, or the area that's allowed during Shabbat. It was amazing, having always seen the settlements from below as looming, menacing alien invaders, then being in one with a delightful, non-political woman, a true intellectual. I found myself thinking how in many ways it would be a lovely place to live, except for the racism. Certainly the Orthodox tradition of no electricity on the Sabbath leads to so many positive things. Quiet, community, focus on family, and everyone's walking. As you know me, the walkways wound around everywhere, right through people's backyards. You can imagine how this did to my pedestrian-loving heart. But then there's the racism. We were 9 at dinner, mainly Baltimore Jews and a couple of native-born Israelis. It was pleasant for the first hour. They were impressed by my Hebrew during the prayers, but something was definitely hanging in the air. Gail, the hostess on my left, dropped the bomb. She asked whether I thought Arabs were a violent people. Do you think Arabs are a violent people? It's like a yes or no question. It was one of those moments in your life when you take a breath and say to yourself, think first, then speak. My first response was how hard it was for me to generalize about Arabs. I found Moroccans to be so different from Saudis and Lebanese so different from Egyptians. When Gail pressed me, I said, to tell the truth, I had been kidnapped in Mexico City, mugged in Sao Paulo, had witnessed a shootout in Johannesburg. Actually, since this, I was carjacked in Minneapolis and had a good friend murdered in Washington, D.C. In comparison, the Arab world, with its low crime rates and strong social links, felt very safe to me, which it does. I feel way safer in Tunisia than I did in Florida. That's a fact. This did not please Gail. So she asked, well then, what about Gaza? I explained patiently that I had in fact never been to Gaza. The Israeli government had not allowed me to go. But at least in the West Bank, where I was staying, the people were very gracious and I felt very safe. The cloud hung in the air, and finally I spoke what was unspoken. I pointed out that their situation was quite different from mine. They were living in an outpost that the people surrounding believed was an illegal colony, not too dissimilar from what white Americans may have felt in Apache country in 1870s Arizona. My own experience was vastly different, speaking their language and coming on their terms. I didn't say it, but I was dances with wolves. At this, all their thoughts and feelings began to tumble out. Every time the more hard-hearted ones said something outrageous about the Arabs, I took a breath and told them that wasn't my experience. I shared a positive story, trying to be funny if I could. Nama was great, and in such times it's wonderful having someone loving holding the tone. I also liked her husband, Richard, who shared his fears rather than his hatred. It wasn't easy. The guests included a man, Kai, who was young and full of testosterone. At one point, he realized I did not consider the West Bank to be part of Israel. He got very upset, explaining that God had given them the land. I patiently explained that the argument did not hold much water with me, an atheist. But more importantly, how could he be surprised that I did not see it as part of Israel, since every country in the world considered those lands occupied? This upset Kai so much that he got up and left the room to read prayers. But I never raised my voice or even let my blood boil. I was trying hard not to get caught in any argument. I was their guest. Toward the end of the evening, I asked Nama's husband, Richard, if he knew any Arabs. It turned out that none of them did. Even though they'd lived in the community for over 5 years, they had never spoken with an Arab. I asked Richard why he feared Arabs so much. He said that he believed that it was their religion to kill Jews. This was factually incorrect. I pointed out that Jews had lived far better among Muslims than among Christians. I had celebrated Passover in Morocco, taught the Jewish school in Tunisia, etc. All of them in various ways, the Jews in Arab lands said that Jewish life in the Arab world was actually pretty good before the creation of Israel. Contrast that with Christian pogroms, auto da fe, the Spanish Inquisition, the Holocaust. I said to Richard, my mother was Irish Catholic. Why aren't you afraid that I'm going to take this knife and kill you? As the son of a Christian, seemed just as logical. It helps to keep your calm and focus on listening. By the end of the evening, I felt warmly towards all of them, even Kai. I really don't want to create more heat. I hugged him when I left, and I promised him that if I worked to build a Palestinian state, it was with hopes that it was good for Israel, which I believe. As Nama walked me out, she said that one day she wanted to meet me in Ramallah, where she had never been. I was astonished. I was deeply touched by this. We decided she should wear a Muslim headdress. I said, you wear the Muslim shmata instead of the Jewish shmata, which she said apparently is fine halachically, according to Jewish law. So I promised I'd invite her to lunch in Ramallah. I found out later that Israeli Jews were forbidden from going to Palestinian territories. They are not allowed. So the tour could not happen. Unfortunately, 2 years later, Nama passed away of a sudden illness, but her courage and her honesty remain with me. I recently looked up Kfar Damim. It's now twice as large as what it is. The Israeli government tore down the nearby veteran village, and today it is supported by Christian evangelicals.
CFOIC Heartland welcomes you to our communities, where the people of Israel have returned to Judea and Samaria in fulfillment of prophecy.
In attitudes, there's still a large group of Israelis and Palestinians who believe that a two-state solution could work. And this is especially true of the secular Israelis. So the people that you and I would hang out in Tel Aviv with and have a drink still feel that a two-state solution is possible. and that's also similar to the Palestinians. That's not true for the right-wing Israelis. They don't believe it's possible. And that's the people I felt were most hostile. Arabs are kind of evenly split. I'm, of course, afraid that since of what's happened in Gaza, the Hamas attack and the unbelievable Israeli response, and I have to say something very important. I feel killing a 5-year-old child is wrong, always, whether it's with a machine gun or dropping bombs on a building. And just so you know, I know the statistics. For every one Israeli child killed by Palestinians, there have been over 10 Palestinian children killed by Israelis for the last 20 years. And it seems to be a policy that you take one of ours, we're going to take 10 of yours, which is what's happening in Gaza. I can't accept that. I can't accept it. Killing children is wrong. Yes, we've done it. I mean, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, there were hundreds of thousands of children killed, as there were in Dresden, as there were in other places, in the London bombing. But we need to get to a place where we don't accept it, where it's not allowed, especially in those kinds of numbers. As Israel moves to the right, next page, as American attitudes grow more aware of the Palestinian plight, attitudes here are shifting. Democrats are, for the first time this year, more sympathetic to Palestinians than Israelis. So there's been a real shift in attitudes in this country. It's very generational. A majority of Americans, including Jewish Americans, would be happy to restrict aid to Israel based on the settlements. So that's a majority opinion. It's almost 60%. That's not radical to ask that of our politician. Only Orthodox Jews remain with the unfettered support of Israel. Reform Jews and conservative Jews have moved away, and the Israelis know this. They know that there's been a big gap, and that Netanyahu has really made that gap much bigger. There's a growing age gap. This is from a CNN poll. Younger Americans are far more sympathetic. Israel's military response to Hamas attacks is fully justified. 81% of people over 65 said yes. Only 27% of people over 34 said yes. That's a gigantic gap. Gigantic. You never see things like that. So this country is changing fast. And I'm asking people why. Part of it is because the old narrative, Israel always good, Palestine always bad, has broken down with multimedia sources and whatever. People can get beyond, Fox News. The other thing is that globally, the world sees Israel as the United States' client state. Here, 67% of the country always supports Israel. You talk to people in Mozambique and Thailand, and they're generally hostile to Israel. Not because of Jews, but because they get what they want from the United States. That's the view that you hear everywhere else. Everywhere, there's this hostility to our special relationship. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do is, we're done with my presentation. I want to say, how can we make it better? And this is what I think about. There are people, and I wanted to have some photographs of people that I know care about who are working on making things better. But what I'd like to do, those of you who want to stay, we're not going to have time for open questions because it's too big a group. I would love it if you could stay half an hour and then make it into groups of around 8. You can turn your chairs around here to make a group of 8. You can go outside, it's gorgeous, carry your chairs or stand in a circle. I want you to assign one person. Let's start with the end of the alphabet. Whoever's name is closest to the end of the alphabet, so Zelda would win, is the scribe. I have paper, we have pencils, there are pencils in the back, and I want you to answer these 2 questions.